कथितां भगवता नारायणेन स्वयं व्यासेन ग्रथितां पुराणमुनिना मध्ये महाभारतम्।
ॐ असतो मा सत्कमय तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गमय मृत्योर्मा अमृतं गमय आविराविर्महेति रुद्रयत्ते दक्षिणं मुखं तेन मां पाहि नित्यम्. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. Last Sunday we saw a little bit about Maya, how it is understood in the Gita and in Vedanta. How, if we look at it objectively, Maya seems to be out there. But subjectively, it's not really out there. Maya is right here. It's the ignorance covering my own self. And one of the things that Maya does is it makes things which are impossible seem possible. That is why Maya is sometimes in Sanskrit, they call it aghatana ghatana patiyasi Maya. In other words, Maya is some mysterious power which seems to make us think that something that has never happened has in fact happened. And because of this mysterious nature of Maya, which seems to make something impossible possible, it is something that we can talk about it, we can think about it, we are all the time surrounded by it, and the question always remains how to get out of it. So one of the things that Maya does is this idea about mortality. It's not merely an idea, it's a very real fear, a real anxiety that is in the hearts of every living creature, an eventual end to a life. Now that's the thing that is predominantly discussed in chapter 8 of the Gita. The chapter 8 is called Akshara Brahma Yoga. Akshara means that which is perishable. Akshara, not perishable. And Brahma. So it's a yoga of the imperishable supreme reality or the supreme being. So although the chapter itself speaks about the imperishable Brahman, a lot of discussion in the chapter is about death or fear of perishing. Now, if I'm that ultimate being, if I'm that divine reality, then there is no end for me. There is no birth, there is no death. We saw that much earlier, right? In the beginning, when Krishna starts teaching Arjuna, he begins by explaining to him the nature of the self, in which he makes it very clear. The self is indestructible, avinashi, that's the phrase that is used in the second chapter, avinashi, that which is indestructible. So it's birthless and deathless, that is who we are. Now the power of Maya is such that even though I never had birth, I feel I was born some years ago. Even though I will never die, I now feel, no, there is such a thing as death. And death is very real to us today, especially as we have already been for a few months in the midst of this pandemic. But somehow, death and illness become more real when we see people whom we know personally being affected by it. Otherwise, while this has some shock value in the beginning, but when numbers start increasing, it all finally gets reduced to simply a statistic. Right now, at this very moment, every minute, at least one or two people in the United States is dying. That's what we read in the papers. But that doesn't hit home, that doesn't become more urgent unless and until we know someone personally who's really had this crisis, any crisis really, but especially now, a COVID-related crisis, then it suddenly becomes real. So just as it becomes more real when people affected by it are close to us, it can become even more real if it is we ourselves who are affected by it. And that possibility, that risk, always exists. And so that is the main theme that gets discussed in the section that we are going to see today. There's a lot of discussion about death. And it's a death of someone who never dies. That's what Maya is. So at one point we hear that I have no birth and no death. And yet there is so much discussion about death because in spite of the assurance given by the Gita and the Vedas that I am birthless and deathless, while it can be comforting, that's not our present experience. Our present experience is, no, I am open to illness. I can fall ill. I can die at some point. And so that's what the Gita discusses in this chapter. And one of the important insights that will come again and again, not only in the Gita but in other Vedanta texts as well, is what happens after death, of course, but also how should we be at the time of death? Does the moment before death have something to teach us or something to we should be careful about? And that is what he discussed. In fact, let's read verses 5, 6, 7, and 8. Antakale cha mameva smaran muktva kalevaram yaprayati samadbhavam yati nastyatra samshayah yam yam vapi smaran bhavam tyajatyante kalevaram tam tamevaiti kaunteya sada tadbhava bhavitah tasmat sarveshu kaleshu mamanusmara yudhya cha mayyarpitamano buddhihi mame vaishyasya samshayah abhyasa yoga yuktena cetasa nanyagamina paramam purusham divyam yati parthanuchintayan. And he who at the time of death, meditating on me alone, goes forth, leaving the body, attains my being, there is no doubt about this. Remembering whatever object at the end, he leaves the body, that alone is reached by him, O son of Kunti, because of his constant thought of that object. Therefore, at all times, constantly remember me and fight. With mind and intellect absorbed in me, thou shalt doubtless come to me. With the mind and mind not moving towards anything else, made steadfast by the method of habitual meditation, and dwelling on the supreme, resplendent Purusha, O son of Pritha, one goes to him. So some important points are discussed here in this verse. So the first thing that we see in verse 5 is that if at the time of death, if I remember God, antakala, that moment of death, if I remember the divine being, if I remember my spiritual ideal, then I will definitely attain my spiritual ideal. Whatever I think of at the time of death will determine what will happen to me after I die. There is a story told in the Bhagavata about a person named Ajamila. Now, this person had not led a particularly honest and good life. So when the time for him to die came, we have stories in Indian mythology which speaks about the messengers of death. So the death is personified as Yama, and the messengers of death are called Yamadutas. So we read in this story, this Ajamila now, who's become old and is sick and is about to die, and the messengers of death, the Yamadutas, come to take him. And he's terrified. He doesn't want to go. And out of fear, he calls out to his son. Now, his son was named Narayana. And so out of fear, the first thing he thinks about is the support of his family and of his eldest son. So he calls out, Narayana, Narayana. And then the story says, well, Narayana is also the name of Vishnu. And then Vishnu then appears and then drives away these messengers of death and protects the devotee. Now, this story has this told in the Bhagavata. It has several things we can learn from it. First of all, he was not even thinking of Vishnu at that time. He was really calling out to his son. But the son was named Narayana, which also happens to be the name of Vishnu. So this story was meant to affirm that the power of God's name, that God's name is never uttered in vain. That if God's name is uttered, then it will lead to some good result. Such is the power. But even more importantly, that he remembered the God's name, even though not having God in mind at that time, but it did save him from whatever he was afraid of. And this story has become so much a part of the Indian tradition that for a long time, to some extent even today, but more in the earlier generations, it was customary to name the children, either giving them some name of a deity or some quality that is connected with spiritual life. And the idea was, since as parents we'll be calling out to our children now and then, it's like 2 in 1. You get to call out the name of your children, and at the same time, you are also chanting the Lord's name. And so, whatever we remember at that moment. So the trick is, for a devotee, if at that moment before my death, if I can remember God, then God will come and protect me, take me to a good place, or how is it put here? Who at the time of death, meditating on me alone, goes forth, leaving the body, attains to my being. Attains to my being. You can understand that phrase in whichever way your philosophy or your worldview takes you. Either that you go physically in the presence of God, go to Vaikuntha, and if you are a worshipper of Vishnu, to Kailash, if you are a worshipper of Shiva, or some heavenly sphere, wherever your form of the divine that you worship and cherish and adore, you will be in touch with, you will be in contact with. Or philosophically, from a non-dualistic perspective, attaining my being would mean that all duality will vanish, and then you will be one with your own true nature. Now, this seems to be an easy way out in some ways. It doesn't matter how I live my life. It doesn't matter what I do. All that I need to do is just before death, I need to remember God. The difficulty is that when there is the moment of death, whether we will be able to remember God. That is the big challenge that devotees have before them. So one of the reasons the japa that we do, the repetitions of God's name that we do, if I can repeat God's name as much as possible right now, it will become so much it become a part of my being. It becomes so natural for my body and mind to be in sync with the repetition of the divine name. Then when it's time to die, even if I am extremely weak, even if I am disoriented, maybe sometimes as people are before death, but because of this past habit of always remembering the divine, I will be able to remember God at that moment of death as well. So that at that last moment, we have to remember the divine. We need to start practicing for that right now. And that is the message that comes to us from these verses that we just read. In verse 6, Krishna says that what we think, if we don't think about God at the moment of death, then whatever it is that we think about, that is where we will go. What it means is that whatever is of the utmost importance to us, whatever is uppermost in our mind, the mind will naturally think about that. And so, as spiritual seekers, we need to see that God is the uppermost in our mind. And that's why I have sometimes encouraged people to make a list, if you like, of seeing what my priorities in life are. And many of us, there are a lot of things that are important to us in life. And we can put them on a list and, if possible, try to see among these things that are on my list, which is most important to me, which is second most, which is third, as much as it is possible to look at it objectively. And then see how important God is. Now, we have to be honest about it. You don't have to show the list to anyone. But, I mean, all of us would like to put God on number one. Aspirationally, that's what we would like to do. But we have to ask ourselves, in the course of the day, how often do I think about God? What is it that my mind most often thinks about? What is it that I am most concerned about? So, while my aspiration may be to have God as the topmost priority, am I investing my prime time and energy into something that is most important to me or not? And so not to feel ashamed about it if God comes in number 3 or 4 or 10 or 12 or 15. If God is not there in our list at all, then we cannot really call ourselves devotees or spiritual seekers. So hopefully God is somewhere there on that list. And maybe as we go through our life's journey, eventually these priorities will change. The list is a very dynamic list. And hopefully, by the time it's time for us to leave and time for us to die, God will be on the topmost list, which would mean that that's my prime concern. And if that's my prime concern, then I will naturally, effortlessly think of God, think of the divine when that moment of death comes. Now, the tricky part is none of us knows where that moment of death is, when it will come. Is it a few days from now, a few months from now, a few years from now? We don't know. And that's what makes it trickier. Because we don't know it, we need to make sure that God gets on top of my list as soon as possible. There is a story about Jada Bharata that many of you may be familiar with. So this is the story of a sage who lived deep inside a forest. He had a small hermitage of his own, and he spent his time in prayer, meditation, all by himself. Now one day, when he was inside his little hermitage, he heard some sound outside. And then he goes out and he finds a deer, a baby deer, had arrived there. It was being chased. It had gotten separated from its family, separated from its mother, and was probably being chased by some wild animal. So to protect that little baby deer, the sage took that deer inside his hermitage. And because its mother was nowhere to be found, he kept the deer with him. And then he daily fed that deer, and the deer soon became very devoted to the sage. And was a great joy. I mean, just like people have a dog or a cat as a pet, the deer became a kind of pet to that sage. So months and years passed. When the sage grew old, he knew the time for his death had come. And as he lay on his bed, this deer, who had been with him now for quite some time, also sensed that the sage was about to go. So the deer came by the bed and sat by him. And as the life force of the sage, the prana, was about to leave, the sage looked at that deer, and his one concern was, who will look after this deer after I leave? And it so happened that just at that moment of his dying, the last thought in his mind was about the deer. And then the story goes on to say that he was reborn in next birth as a deer, because that's what he was thinking about at that moment. But because he had done a lot of spiritual practices earlier, even in that deer body in the subsequent birth, he retained memory of what had happened. So because of the good samskara, the good mental impressions that he had, as a deer, then he just lived and moved around the hermitages of sages. He just kind of made his home as a hermitage of different sages and lived in that holy atmosphere because of these impressions from the previous birth. And so when his deer life ended, he was reborn. And this time he was reborn in a human body again. And his name was Bharata. The memory remained. Again, because he was an evolved soul, the memory of what had happened in his last two births remained with him. And he remembered that he could have been enlightened, he could have been free from this cycle of birth and death if he hadn't gotten attached to that deer. And so he decided, I'm not going to get attached to anyone and anything now. Now, one way attachments do develop is when we cultivate relationships, when we meet with people, we talk with people, we get involved into the activities of this world. And so this Bharata then said, I'm going to be just, I'm going to be, act like a dumb, stupid person, a person who cannot even speak, who doesn't know anything. Although he has all that knowledge inside, because generally we see that people who don't make contacts, people who can't communicate, people who are dull and stupid, everyone generally tends to leave them alone because there isn't much interaction possible with such people. And so he thought that's one way where I will have minimal contact with everyone. Everyone will leave me to myself, and then this body will go, and I would not have created any new attachments in life. And so that's how days and months passed. So one day he was just sitting somewhere in his under a tree, and a king was passing by that path. And as in those days, the king was being taken in a palanquin and was being carried by 4 people. That's how no automobiles and no other modes of transportation. And so one of the men who was carrying the sage, carrying the king, wasn't feeling well, and I think he stumbled or something. And so with 3 people, it was difficult to continue. And they suddenly found this young man sitting under a tree, who was this Bharata. So the king's man called him and said, hey, come and lend your shoulder, and because the king has to be taken. And of course, if the king wants it, then you cannot say no. And so then Bharata was one of the 4 palanquin bearers, and then they went on. After some time, they found that the palanquin wasn't really being held properly, that there was a movement. And they said, why? Why is there a movement like that? And then they found that this Bharata, while he was walking, he found some ants and some small insects on the path. And he was being careful not to step on them. And because of that, the walking wasn't very smooth. And then the king's palanquin was shaken. And the king said, hey, why are you doing like that? Why don't you just walk normally the way others are walking? And then Bharata said, well, there are these little ants on the way. I don't want to step on them. I don't want to hurt them. They will die if I step on them. And then these men started laughing. And the king said, don't be foolish. Just don't care. Just walk. And then this Bharata then gives it's a very eloquent, not exactly a discourse, but explanation about, that was the first time he had ever spoken so at length. And he then points out that even in this tiniest of creatures is that same divine being, and they had thought him to be a kind of a stupid vagabond sitting under a tree. Then the king gets down and then falls at his feet. And then we see that he became enlightened in that birth itself, Bharata, and was not reborn again. So this is the story that comes in the books. The idea again is this, that even a very advanced spiritual seeker, because he thought about the deer at the time of dying, he was reborn as a deer. So the importance of being vigilant about what I think of at that last moment is reinforced through stories such as that. And that is why, as verse 7 points out, we need to remember God always. And then verse 8, Abhyasa Yoga Yuktena, that this thing can happen, Abhyasa, only through practice. And therefore, devotees are encouraged to do japa daily, regularly, because only when the mantra that we repeat becomes our friend. The sound of the mantra becomes the source of strength. The form of the deity, the form of the Ishta, is somewhere that the mind loves to go. We know that wherever our mind feels comfortable, wherever our mind feels joy, the mind naturally goes towards that thing. We don't have to make too much effort. So right now, if we need too much effort to repeat God's name and to keep our attention focused on our chosen deity, that effort is an indication that I still need to do a lot more to come closer to the divine. I still need to develop that natural, spontaneous relationship with the divine. Because we see in our life that people whom we love, people who are close to us, we don't need to make any effort to think about them. It just happens naturally. So if we can cultivate that kind of a close relationship with God, then we will think of God all the time naturally. Swami Vivekananda defined religion as the eternal relationship between the eternal self and eternal God. So it's an eternal relationship. We are already related to God. It's not like we are forging a new relationship. We are already related to God, but somehow we seem to have forgotten it. And the practice of prayer, worship, meditation, scriptural study, selfless service are ways by which we recover the memory that we are already related to the Supreme Being. And then verses 9 through 13 in this chapter, Krishna teaches what is called sometimes Omkara Sadhana, about how Om, which is the most sacred sound in Vedic scriptures, how one can meditate with the help of Om. And we know that many of the mantras in the Vedanta tradition have Om as a part of its the prayer. Verse 15, look at the verse 15 and 16. These are important verses. Let me read the verses to you. Mamupetya punarjanma dukkhalayam ashashvatam napnuvanti mahatmanaha samsiddhim paramam gataha abrahma bhuvana loka punaravartinorjuna mamupetya tu kaunteya punarjanmana vidyate. Reaching the highest perfection and having attained me, the great souled ones are no more subject to rebirth, which is the home of pain and ephemeral. All the worlds, O Arjuna, including the realm of Brahma, are subject to return. But after attaining me, O son of Kunti, there is no rebirth. So, the Gita teaches us that after death, unless we attain to God, we are going to be born again. And the way to attain to God is by remembering God at the last moment. The only way we can remember God at the last moment is if we have practiced enough before that last moment. So all of these japa that we do is a practice for that one perfect remembrance of the divine at the moment of death. So we need a lot of practice before that happens naturally. As I said, none of us knows in what state our body and mind will be when that moment of death comes. If we are fully conscious and alert, perhaps it might be easier then to think of God. But it's also possible that the body may be extremely weak, the mind may be extremely drowsy. We see if we have suffering from long illnesses, the effects of medications, the effects of some intrusive medical procedures. There could be any number of factors by which we may not be fully alert at that moment of death. But we know that even when we are not fully alert, not fully there, if there is a certain habit that we have cultivated all through life, then just the muscle memory, both the muscle of the body and the muscle of the mind, the muscle memory itself will help us through that stage. I have seen several cases. In fact, there was one of the Swamis many years ago. He was not totally unconscious, but not fully conscious. He was going through an extreme and very prolonged illness, and was going in and out of consciousness. But he always held his japamala, his rosary in hand. And even when that last moment, there was very little physical strength. But all through life, he had done his regular japa. So even in that state, lying in the bed, there wasn't any other movement, but the beads of the mala were going. And we could see a movement of his lips that he was repeating God's name. And so that's what I mean by this practice. If there is practice, then we'll be able to. Then that's what this verse points out. If not, and one of the things that can help, they look at this word which is very important. Verse 15, the word that Krishna, two adjectives that he uses to describe the world in which we live. He said, Dukkhalayam ashashvatam. Ashashvatam means temporary. Everything is constantly changing. It's not eternal. And that's pretty obvious. We see changes occurring all the time, around us and within us as well. But Dukkhalayam, now alaya in Sanskrit means an abode, a home. Dukkhalaya means an abode of dukkha. Alaya, you are familiar with the Himalaya. Now Himalaya, again, Hima means snow. Alaya, abode. So Himalaya, literally, the Himalayas now, which are well known, is really an abode of snow. So Dukkhalaya, an abode of sorrow. And we have seen this on earlier occasions. Why would Krishna refer to this existence as just filled with sorrow? We can see the resonance because that's exactly what Buddha said. Several centuries later, when Buddha appeared, he said exactly the same thing, that it's all suffering, life is suffering. Now, they were not simply referring to the pain and suffering caused by a pandemic or hunger or thirst or homelessness. Now, that's true. All these things do bring a lot of pain and suffering. But what they were pointing to is a deeper, a subtler kind of suffering. And that deeper suffering is just the presence of this illness, that the body is not perfect, the mind is not perfect. Sickness is a reality in life. We may not be sick all the time, but none of us can say that we will never fall sick. We may not have to clear the throat all the time, but we can never say, I have never had a reason to clear my throat any time in my life either. So that's a reality of life. Same thing, of course, with death. No one is exempt from death. Then there is the process of aging itself. All of us who have passed through these stages, childhood, youth, and middle age, and now old age, all of these stages we cannot stop the process of aging. And the process of aging has its great joys, but it also has its great pains associated with it. Now, referring to these inevitable, inseparable realities of human existence, that is what Krishna is referring to here as an abode of sorrow, because all of these things have a lot of sorrow associated with it. So, remembering this, because the thing is this, the tricky part is if we lull ourselves into thinking, oh, this is such a fine world, this is wonderful, it's great, then being reborn doesn't seem like such a terrible idea. Well, this is such a wonderful world. I would like to come again and again and again. But if we have developed enough sensitivity to know that in spite of all the blessings, in spite of the wonders around us, the foundation of human existence is this death, sickness, aging, stress, anxiety, and worry. The proportion with which all the stress and anxiety people have, that might vary from person to person. But that is the reality inseparable from human existence. And so we might have to ask, do I really want to go through all this again? As somebody was saying some years ago, they said, I'm not so much worried about the process of aging and things like that. But the whole idea of having to go through school all over again and having to do all the homework and they said, that's why I want to become enlightened and go. I don't want to go back to school again. Whatever it is that might help me from recognizing that our present existence is by no means perfect. And I don't want to keep coming again and again in this imperfect cycle of birth and death. That is the way I can generate enough motivation in my heart to become free and to become enlightened. And then in the latter part, towards the end of this chapter, 25, 26, 24, 25, 26 verses, the three verses, they're kind of very short, very condensed way of describing what happens to a soul, what happens to a person after they die. Now, there isn't time to go through it, nor is there too many details given here either. So the broad outline is simply this, that if I die and at the time of death my last thought is about God, then that helps me attain to my spiritual ideal, either directly or indirectly, but it takes me along my spiritual journey. If I remember anything or anyone other than God at that last moment, then that will determine the trajectory of where I will go after I die. And then, as the Gita points out, again, very, very briefly, and this is elaborated to some extent in some of the Upanishad, the Chandogya Upanishad, for instance. But again, even there, the language used is very symbolical. So to exactly know what is happening, you won't find really too many details, but you know that after a person dies, depending on the karma, if they haven't become enlightened, if they were not immersed in the thought of God at the moment of death, then their post-mortem existence is determined by the karma. The karma that they have done will determine where they'll go, where they'll be reborn, what they'll experience. But all of these people who have not become enlightened will have to come back, no matter where we go after death. Which form of heaven? The highest heaven described in the books is called Brahmaloka. even that highest heaven, the Gita points out, is not a place of no return. That even from that highest heaven, a Brahma Bhuvana Lokaha Punaravartinorjuna, that all these heavens, all these celestial worlds are only places of temporary residence. That sooner or later, after the effects of if I go to heaven, the effects of my good karma, if I go to hell, the effects of my bad karma, sooner or later that is going to get exhausted and I will have to be reborn again. So we keep on being born again and again and again until we know that I need to get out of it. Until we first of all want to get out of it. Not many people want to. But those who want to then through practice, they do spiritual practices. There is no one definitive practice. Whichever way they are able to connect with the infinite, and there are so many different traditions, there are so many different practices, whichever works best for us, as pointed out to us by our teacher, we keep on doing that practice and then we become free. So this is, in a nutshell, the main insights we find in chapter 8. It's primarily about death and so on, as we saw. So we will take a short break now, and then if you have any ideas, comments, questions, please feel free to share them. Om Jananim Saratam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhur Muhuhu. Okay, we'll take a look at some of the questions. First question: at the moment of death, what is the role of the Guru in liberation or transmigration? I don't know. In the sense that there isn't a very definitive answer to this question. There have been cases where devotees have had vision of their Guru or their Ishta at the time of death. So it's possible to say that the Guru comes and helps the disciple at the time of death, but not everyone has had that experience. So that is not kind of a very definitive way of saying that this is what the Guru will do at the time of death. But there is one thing that is mentioned, and that is this one form of mukti, one form of liberation, one way of being free is called krama mukti, or gradual liberation. That is, if someone has been a sincere spiritual seeker, but at the moment of death has not yet realized God, has not yet become enlightened, but because this person therefore has led a good life, will go to some highest heaven. And the highest heaven, as I said, is often referred to as Brahmaloka. Now, heaven is a place often described in books as a place filled with enjoyments. In other words, a lot of distractions. Great music, great food. So, even in our present day-to-day life, how do we deal with distractions? And there are times we might find in our life when we are able to keep to our spiritual practices in a better way than on some other days. There are times when, like a festive occasion, there's a lot of music going on, and I love music. And if there's a lot of dances going on, if a person, I love dances, there's a lot of great food, and then I say, well, for the next 10 days or so, there's all these festivities going on. It's not possible for me to meditate that well now. Let me enjoy this, and then after the festival is over, I'll get back to my spiritual practice. And some of us do that. So if it's possible for my spiritual practice to be affected by these external celebrations or festivities or distractions, then after I die and go to whichever heaven, my spiritual practice will be affected by there as well. In fact, there would be a more intense form of enjoyment, much more intense than it's available on this sphere of existence. But let's say if I've been such a sincere seeker that I can avoid the distractions in this life, but I have, at the time of death, I have not become enlightened, then whichever heaven I'll go, in spite of all the distractions there, what I might do is I'll find some quiet spot, and I'm sure there will be a lot of quiet spots in heaven. So I will say, now I don't want all this fun and frolic in heaven. I'm going to find some quiet spot and continue abhyasa. If I had this practice here, because the same mind is going there, that mind already has these impressions, I will find a quiet spot in heaven and continue my practice. And now, if I continue my practice and I have come this close to enlightenment, still not quite, haven't become enlightened yet, but come very close to it. And that is the time when the scriptures say, that's the time the Guru then, figuratively they describe, Guru then extends a hand and pulls the disciple just at the finishing line. So what it means is I need to do enough to be able to reach close enough to then to get Guru's help. But if I say, well, I'm not really going to do anything at all and let the Guru and Ishta take care of me, that seems a little bit difficult. Next question. Achieving liberation by remembering God at the last moment seems like a shortcut. Couldn't one have someone by their side in their last moments, reminding him or her to remember God? Good question. It's not really a shortcut. As I said, in order to remember God at that last moment, I need to be practicing intensely all through my life. So it's a fairly long cut because if I don't practice before, I won't be able to remember God at that last moment. And having someone by the side to remind them can be helpful, and that's what people generally do. That's why when someone is on a deathbed, and someone is in the last critical moments of someone's life, usually the family gets around and surrounding the bed will pray. Sometimes they will do some chanting of the Gita or some prayer. Now those are ways, those are opportunities for someone, not only for the family to pray for the person who is about to die, but the person then to become aware of prayer and remembering God. So those things can be helpful. But again, even for that, there has to be some practice. There has to be some openness. I remember, this was quite some years ago, I got a call from MGH, Mass General Hospital, saying that there is a patient who is very seriously ill, and the family had requested the presence of a Hindu priest or a monk. And so whenever there are such cases, oftentimes MGH and some of the other nearby hospitals, they call me and I go and I chant a prayer, I speak with the family, I do the best I can. So in this instance, I had been there, it was pretty late, almost it was, I think around 8 o'clock or so. I went, I was given the room number where the patient was. So I went to that floor. I was at the nurse's station and I told them whom I had come to meet. and then they said they will send a word. And then the the person who was, I think, the husband of the patient, came to meet me at the nurse's station, and he thanked me for coming, and he just seemed very unsure. And I said, "Is there some matter?" He said, "No, you please wait." And I kept on waiting. So 5 minutes passed, and then his son came, and then they started chatting with me, but they were not taking me to the patient for whom I was called. And I realized after about 5 or 10 minutes something is wrong. So I said, I just came because my presence was requested, but if it's no longer needed, I'm fine. I can just go back. So don't worry about it. And then they finally explained to me what the situation was. And the situation was this: as soon as they informed the patient that a Swami was coming, the patient freaked out, because I imagine the patient thought, "Oh, that means my last moment has come," and just didn't want to even entertain the idea that I may be dying soon. So forget about wanting to remind someone. Sometimes people can be terrified by it. If I'm not practiced thinking about God, then even if people around me are praying, even if people around me tell me, think about God, rather than be grateful for that reminder, I can freak out, I can get upset, I can get angry, I can say, "What do you think? I'm going to die that you want me to think about God?" Any number of reactions are possible. So it's not a shortcut. Practice, with the more we practice with faith, with regularity, with devotion throughout our lives, that will help at that last moment. In fact, the test of our spirituality is how we encounter death. It's possible to read a lot of books. It's possible to impress other people with one's religiosity or spirituality. It's possible to be impressive in many ways. But if I cannot handle the last moment of my death well, then it really doesn't help a lot. So I think that's the ultimate test of our faith, of our devotion, of our practices, of how I deal with my own death. Clearly, we have enough practice in the beginning of how we deal with the deaths around us, of people we know and people we don't know. But that's a little bit easier than dealing with one's own death. And so that's the ultimate test. Next question. We often hear about Ramakrishna Loka, the Holy Mother and Thakur coming at the time of death to take us there. Is this a temporary heaven or a permanent state of liberation? From a Vedantic perspective, if we go to a place can never be permanent. Remember, we saw last Sunday that Maya means Desha, Kala, Nimitta, space, time, and causation. So, if I have gone to Ramakrishna Loka as a place, then that place has to exist in some space, and there will be time and there will be causality. So it's not permanent in that sense. But when a devotee goes to a place like this, or when devotees of Ramakrishna will go to Ramakrishna Loka, there are not going to be the kind of distractions there that will take me away from my spiritual goal. So, if in Brahmaloka there may be a few solitary spots to go and meditate, in Ramakrishna Loka, there are lots of places to go and sit and meditate. And there will be Ramakrishna and Holy Mother encouraging us, inspiring us to continue our meditation. And then we continue there, and then we become free from there. So Going to Ramakrishna Loka, the stay in the Ramakrishna Loka would be temporary, in the sense that from there we then reach a higher stage, going beyond name and form, and not just remaining in the presence of God, but being one with that ultimate reality. There is no then distinction beyond that place. I'm reminded of an anecdote in the life of Ramana Maharshi. Now, Ramana Maharshi is considered by many to be the great a non-dualistic teacher who lived not too long ago. So, and he always, one of his primary teachings was always find out who this I is, who the self is. It was very, very philosophical teaching. So one of his followers one day visited him, and that follower had a very great devotional temperament. He was very greatly devoted to Vishnu. And while he had devoted to Ramana Maharshi, his mind didn't think in non-dualistic terms. And so he knew Ramana Maharshi's teaching, always asking, find out who you are. And so he, with great earnestness, went to Ramana Maharshi once and asked him, will I be able to have a vision of Vishnu after I die? You know, it's like this suddenly becoming non-dual just seems too abstract. Will I be able to meet Vishnu after I die? And Ramana Maharshi looked at him and said, yes, of course. If you want to meet Vishnu after you die, you will meet Vishnu after. And then he said, when I go to Vaikuntha and live with Vishnu, will Vishnu speak with me? And Ramana Maharshi said, yes, of course, he will speak with you. And then he asked Ramana Maharshi, what will Vishnu say to me? And then Ramana Maharshi said, Vishnu will look at you and say, find out who you are. So the idea is, sure, of course we can meet, have all these, whatever the longing of our heart is to meet Vishnu or Shiva or Ramakrishna or Buddha, all of that is possible. But in one way or other, ultimately, we will have to go beyond form, beyond name, beyond space, time, and causality. That's the idea. Sometimes it seems likely that heaven and hell and such are states of mind we pass through in this life, and like a glass of water poured back in the ocean, our Atman is merged in Brahman. Sure, in fact, it's possible to see even our present experience of this world as a state of mind. In fact, there is a school in Buddhist thought which completely denies the existence of the objective world, that everything is just a different state of the mind. So there are schools of thought who subscribe to that view. Swami Vivekananda presents a very fascinating scenario, and it was this, that just like we have series of dreams, it's usually we don't have just one dream per night. Oftentimes, most people have 2, 3 or more dreams. And the dream that we remember, we don't remember, most of us don't remember our dreams, of course. But there are sometimes, some of the dreams we remember after waking up in the morning, and that tends to be the last dream before we woke up. But before that, we may have had 2 or 3 dreams in the same night. So just like we have these different dreams at night, Swamiji says, this waking experience is one dream. Then when we sleep, then there is, of course, another dream. Deep sleep is another dream. So we could say our entire present life is nothing but we are rotating from one dream to the next. Waking dream to dream to deep sleep dream. In fact, there is an Upanishad called the Aitareya Upanishad, which says, Tatra Traya Swapnaha, there are three kinds of dreams. So, although we generally tend to speak about waking, dream, and deep sleep, the Upanishad itself says there are three kinds of dream: the waking dream, the dream, and deep sleep dream. And Swamiji now then adds on or expounds on this idea by saying, death is another dream. You go to a heaven, that's another dream. If you go to a hell, that's another dream. Well, it's a nightmare. So, heavens, hells, this life, next life, all of these things are just a series of dreams. And we are just going from one dream to another dream. And these dreams will end only when we wake up. And waking up, a person who is awakened, that person is the Buddha. The word Buddha means one who is awake. And so, as long as we are not enlightened, we are all dreaming. So yes, it's possible to look upon all heaven and everything as just different dreams. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto you.